Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I am the director of the Wilson Center's Latin America program. I'm excited to welcome you to today's dialogue on Colombia's new approach to Venezuela's prolonged political, economic, and humanitarian crises. For many years, the United States and other international actors have sought regional leadership to improve human rights conditions in Venezuela and to promote dialogue between the authoritarian government and the democratic opposition, hoping to address humanitarian conditions and ultimately bring about a return to democracy. For a time, the Lima Group, made up of the region's largest nations, had played that role. But political changes in several Lima Group countries made it difficult to build consensus on the best approaches to Venezuela. Eventually, even the government in Lima abandoned the Lima Group. Instead, a group of newly elected leaders in the region have been trying new and to this point largely uncoordinated strategies, including, above all, direct engagement with Nicolás Maduro and his government, who had been kept at arm's length by many of their conservative predecessors. The biggest change has occurred in Colombia. Colombia's new president, Gustavo Petro, entered office following a predecessor who had strongly supported investigations into Maduro at the International Criminal Court and adopted a hard line toward the Venezuelan regime. By contrast, Pedro and his foreign minister are in regular contact with Maduro, have traveled to Caracas, and the two countries have reopened their border. Now, Colombia is taking on an even more direct role in the Venezuela crisis. This past Thursday, Petro was in Washington to meet President Biden at the White House, and the two discussed Venezuela. Following that visit in the Oval Office, he swiftly returned to Colombia to meet with members of the Venezuelan opposition. In preparation for a high-profile foreign ministers summit he is hosting today in Bogotá. For its perspective, the White House seems to have adopted a wait-and-see posture toward today's summit and Petro's engagement in Venezuela. After all, previous approaches to Venezuela, focused primarily on sanctions and isolation, ultimately failed to catalyze a public uprising or serious elite defections. Instead, the Venezuelan government consolidated its hold on the country. In the meantime, corruption, economic mismanagement, sanctions, and the repression of dissent led more than 7 million Venezuelans to flee over the last decade, many remaining in neighboring countries and elsewhere in Latin America. The Biden administration has expressed interest in a negotiated solution and shown a willingness to trade sanctions for meaningful concessions from the regime. It has put its hope in the sporadic negotiations in Mexico City, supported by Norway. Now, today's Bogotá summit appears to open a potential new avenue to bring together representatives of the Venezuelan opposition and the government, even if they will not meet face-to-face at this moment. If successful, it could model ways that Latin America's new leftist leaders, including Lula da Silva of Brazil, could use their relationships with the Venezuelan dictatorship to nudge the country toward a political opening. Success, however, is by no means guaranteed. So far, the renewed regional engagement with Maduro has reduced his diplomatic isolation, but not led to the release of political prisoners, meaningful guarantees for free and fair elections next year, or even resume negotiations in Mexico City. It's also not yet clear whether Petro has truly prioritized democratization and human rights in his engagement with Maduro. In some ways, however, today's summit is a success, albeit a modest one. Representatives from 19 countries are participating, as well as negotiators from the Maduro government and the opposition unitary platform, and a representative of Europe. Most importantly, it has put Latin American governments in the driver's seat, giving them a direct role in the complex process of guiding Venezuela back toward democracy, however incrementally. At the same time, it has shown the enormous complexities of getting involved in this bitter political dispute, as was clear in the unexpected and brief presence in Colombia, of Venezuelan opposition figure Juan Guaidó on Monday. To understand the significance of the Bogotá summit and how it fits in the broader regional and international efforts to promote a democratic transition in Venezuela, I'm joined by three fantastic experts: Dr. Benedicte Bull, a professor at the University of Oslo, who joins us from Norway; Ivan Briscoe, the Latin America Program Director at the International Crisis Group, who joins us from Peru, if I'm not mistaken; Marisela Gombat, a researcher at the University of Sao Paulo; who joins us from Brazil. To moderate this important dialogue, I'm joined by my colleague, Michael Penfold, a global fellow at our Latin America program, who is based in Caracas. Michael, please take it away.
Thanks, Ben, for the background and the introduction. And it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to share this panel with such a great group of experts on the region, and with a particular focus on the current situation in Venezuela. I would like to start with Ivan exploring the motivations behind Petro's decision to initiate this conference in Venezuela in an attempt to move and to reignite the talks in Mexico City, which have been basically very sporadic and dying off during the last 2 years. So I would like, Ivan, if you can explain to us, given your expertise on Colombia, why is Petro doing this? And what are his beliefs that he can be successful at dealing with a case such as Venezuela that so far has remained pretty much intractable?
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Benjamin, and to the other guests on this panel. Well, let's dial back in time a little bit to last year. Petro made it clear in his election campaign that he wished to restore relationships with Venezuela. He wished to turn the page on Ivan Duque, his predecessor's unsuccessful campaign to oust Maduro and to spark a transition with free and fair elections in Venezuela. And he did this at great speed, restoring relations, reopening the embassy, and always with an idea on involving Venezuela in crucial issues for the future of Colombia. By that, I mean the border security, the negotiations with the ELN, the National Liberation Army, the rebel group in which Venezuela is a guarantor, on some form of joint cooperation, which is still not been consolidated, on dealing with the 2.5 million Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. There were so many bilateral issues, which were so deep to the core of Petro's agenda of trying to bring greater peace and security and equality to Colombia, that it was, he regarded it as foolhardy not to seek a strong, renewed diplomatic tie with Caracas. And what those first months were notable for was the way both the new Colombian ambassador to Caracas and the foreign minister embraced the Maduro government and refrained from criticizing it in any way. So it was a great change from the days of Ivan Duque. And for some critics of the Petro government, it seemed that they were giving Caracas everything which Maduro wanted and not pressing them in any direction towards competitive elections, human rights, and progress on the human rights front. But that started to change. And here's the interesting thing. The way that Petro started to introduce a few more democratic and human rights demands in his rhetoric and his policy towards Venezuela, starting in November with the expectation that Venezuela would join the Inter-American System on Human Rights. And then obviously moving into this year, and as we'll see, I'm sure in the course of the discussion, to broaden the policy towards Venezuela, towards the discussion on elections next year and a fully negotiated settlement between government and opposition. So what happened there? Why did Petro risk that relatively stable, non-conflictive relationship he'd restored with Caracas to take on a much broader agenda of supporting a negotiated outcome between government and opposition in Venezuela? And I think that's really a crucial issue. And to be absolutely honest, Michael, I don't have the complete answer to it, but I think there are two things that we can start with to start considering. I think one is the fact that Petro sees himself now to a degree as a pivot between Venezuela, but also other left-wing countries, left-leaning countries, democratic or authoritarian in Latin America, and the United States. The United States remains absolutely crucial as an ally of Colombia, as a funder for its peace programs, as a backer of its work in security and justice. And that alliance cannot be broken without huge cost to Colombia. And it's important to underline that this particular initiative on Venezuela is not exclusively a Colombian initiative. It has US backing. It is fully supported by the United States, or particularly the high levels of the US administration. And that is evident in the strength of the US delegation, which has gone to Bogota to take part. And I think Petro understands that working between Venezuela and the United States is something which could be of benefit to Venezuela, could help consolidate or maintain a strong relationship with the United States, even if to others it might seem extremely precarious. And lastly, I would just add to that, there is no doubt that for Petro, and this was clear in his speech at the beginning to open the event in Bogota today, that he sees himself as a regional leader. He sees himself not merely as prompting a historical transformation of Colombia, but of bringing a new era of progressive democratic egalitarianism to Latin America as a whole, to healing the wounds of Latin America's past. And I think his efforts to solve Venezuela's conflict are part of that agenda and part of his own desire to become a real regional leader, not just a leader. There is no doubt ego that is also part of this initiative.
So, Marcilia, Lula was also, I think, after he was elected, Maduro as president in Venezuela. Was a big shift of policy from where Bolsonaro was. But nonetheless, after he was elected, I think he has been more focused on other issues, particularly on the war of Ukraine and China, and really not that focused on the crisis in Venezuela, although Celso Amorín visited Caracas 3 weeks ago. So, how does is Lula backing this initiative as strongly as the US is? And how do you see Lula's role, if any, under this initiative that is now led by Petro to try to solve the Venezuelan political conflict in Caracas?
Okay, well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to join this conference. Well, so as you mentioned, Michael, Brazilian with Bolsonaro broke bilateral relations with Venezuela. And we could say that lost almost all the political capital it had built since Fernando Henrique Cardoso with Chavismo, right? So during the campaign, I think Lula avoided to make many comments on Venezuela. It was a matter of strategy because the opposition was pressing him over these issues, these very profound ties in the previous governments, in the previous terms. But now I think Lula wants to bring back Brazil to the global arena, right? And Venezuela is a very important issue for Lula and the whole Brazilian administration. So Amorim is in Bogotá these days. Amorim visited Maduro in Caracas a few weeks ago. And although Lula is making many comments, very controversial comments on Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine, and also on U.S. and central banks, Brazilian central banks policies in U.S. and in China relationship, I think they reach a solution, or at least trying to build a more solid negotiation between the Maduro's government and opposition in Venezuela is very, very important. So for Lula, would be better if he arrived before Petro, right? Because I think it's a goal it's one of the goals of his administration to reach a solution for Venezuela. But now Brazil, Lula's government has arrived later. So Petro was elected before, and now Brazil has to wait in the line. So I think Brazil will try to join, at least in the beginning, the Bogotá initiative to enrich, to strengthen the channels of dialogue between the two sides. It's not clear how these negotiations will progress or evolve, right? We need to wait to see. But it's important to remember that Brazil was one of the few reliable interlocutors for Chavismo until 2014. And one advantage Brazil has comparing to Colombia is that it doesn't have the track record of confrontation and rupture that marked the bilateral relations between Colombia and Venezuela in the beginning of the century, right? So Brazil could add to this initiative by Petro, but it's not so clear so far the real motivation of Brazil in this scenario.
Benedicte, at the beginning, when Petro announced this idea of holding an international conference in Venezuela, the idea was that conference was both the democratic opposition in Venezuela and Chavismo would be the center of the conference, and they would participate. Many feared that that idea was risky because it showed that Petro might be looking to move the negotiation away from Mexico City, which is mediated by Norway, to Bogotá. And I think the whole idea around the conference was slowly transformed into an international conference among different nations and key actors involved in the negotiations in Mexico City. So, given this evolution of this idea, how it has evolved over time, given your expertise, you have been following very closely the negotiations in Mexico City, and in particularly looking at Norway's mediation in that process. Do you think that this conference can strengthen the negotiation process in Mexico City, provided a jumpstart that is now necessary to resume talks after more than 4 months without being able both sides to meet? So how both of these talks or these conferences are gonna reinforce each other, or in fact it might play in the other way. It might end up undermining the negotiation efforts in Mexico City. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I think everybody agrees that the outcome of this conference is really uncertain. So we don't really know what's going to happen, if it's going to move anything. But I think that what my immediate reaction, and I think the reaction of most of us that have followed the negotiations in Mexico, has been that it is a great advantage, because there's no doubt that the Venezuela issue in general and the negotiations more particularly have fallen quite a few steps down on the international list of priorities. It's kind of fallen out of focus. There's little energy internationally to put into that, and it kind of reflects also the mood in Venezuela: desperation, a loss of hope. So I think that the good thing is that this can maybe energize to put some focus on the Venezuela issues. And there's the discourse is a bit double here, because you hear that it could energize the kind of the Mexico track, but it could also result in something else. And I think that it would be a great advantage if it energized the Mexico track, because although there's no major agreements coming out of that, there is a memorandum of understanding that actually kind of points to a path for the rest of the talks, and obliges the parties to behave in a certain way. It hasn't really limited comments in different directions, but at least there is an agreement. And of course, it is the partial agreement from 2022 on that's focused on the humanitarian needs. So I think that, and in those two agreements, you have all the issues of the democratic change, the needed democratic changes, the issues of human rights, and the issues of the humanitarian situation that I think is very important to also address in order to kind of visualize for the people in Venezuela that there is some benefits to them and not just some kind of long-term, very abstract changes that might come out of it. So I think it's principally positive. The fact that there is a conference in Colombia that actually now gets a lot of attention. I of course think it's unfortunate different events that have happened over the last 24 hours that kind of makes visible to the world the divisions within the opposition and a number of other issues that are not very helpful for moving the negotiations back on track. But I think it's an important move, and I also think that we also, when discussing the negotiations, there's very often mention of the need for a strong group of friends among the Latin American countries, and lots of harking back to the Contadora group around the negotiations for peace in Central America. And so I think that if this can be such a group, and it's a group that that is also put together in a way that very much reflects a change of kind of global power relations with including South Africa and Turkey, and also Latin American and European states, and with a strong presence of the US, I think that that can potentially move the negotiations forward.
So, Ivan, let me ask you the following question about the US involvement in this conference. There was a previous very important meeting between President Biden and President Petro in DC. The talk was not all about Venezuela, but they definitely spoke about this initiative. And Petro came out with two images, one phrase and one image. The phrase was, we want zero sanctions, more democracy. That was his sort of view of summarizing Colombia's view on how to move forward in Venezuela. And the second thing he said, along what Benedict was saying, is that Colombia believes that you have to move in two parallel tracks, one where you have talks on sanctions, and the other one where you have a talk about elections and democracy. So far, the US has conditioned one track with the other. Petro is thinking that they should move in tandem. So when one stops, the other should stop, but they should move in tandem independently of each other. Is this workable? I mean, is it, we've been talking about this now for over 2 years. And so far it has been very difficult. The US has shown some intention of flexibilizing sanctions with the license to Chevron. It has engaged in direct talks with between Miraflores and the White House in terms of political prisoners exchange that happened last year. And as Benedict said, also they created this a humanitarian fund, a social fund, which has been impossible to implement, and which is now the excuse for Chavismo not to sit in Mexico City. So given this idea of zero sanctions, right, and more democracy, how do you do this? I mean, how is he gonna manage to get both sides together and include the US formally? Because the US so far is not a formal member of the negotiations. They're not even observing the talks, although they're a critical actor. So how can Petro move that story forward?
I think Petro has nuanced his position on sanctions over recent weeks. I think there's no doubt that there is a tendency, there was, of Petro to believe that it was essential to start removing all sanctions, to aim for the removal of all sanctions. And indeed, this is exactly Nicolás Maduro's position. Maduro's position is remove all sanctions and then let's talk. I mean, obviously, that is his initial bargaining position. It's very difficult to imagine that could possibly be the outcome of talks with the United States, but that is his position. And there's sympathy, I think, from Petro for that point of view. And I think we should understand why Petro, to a degree, shares that point of view when you see the effects of sanctions on the Venezuelan economy and the spillover of those effects into Colombia in terms of migration, which is set to reach extraordinary unseen rates through the Darien Gap connecting Colombia and Panama this year. 400,000 migrants, not all of them Venezuelan, but a lot of them Venezuelan. So I think there's a real serious understanding in Colombia the need to remove as a priority sanctions. But of course, in Washington last week, the rhetoric changed somewhat. It moved towards more of the position of a gradual removal of sanctions in accordance with progress towards the democratic goals, the goals of competitive elections, with various staging points along the way. This morning, he spoke about the electoral calendar and progressive lifting of sanctions as moves towards a firm electoral calendar with democratic guarantees are put into place. There's also talk, we believe, in the concept note, which lies behind the conference, which is taking place today, concept note, which has not been broadly distributed, but which is known to both sides, government and opposition in Venezuela. Of course, it's known to the Colombian government, which devised it and has been shared with the United States, which talks about various other measures, which could perhaps include the lifting of restrictions on opposition candidates and the release of political prisoners. Now, what you are referring to, Michael, I think, is the dynamic in which one side gives something up and the other side responds by giving something up. You're saying that there have to be, whether it's in tandem, in parallel, mutual concessions, there has to be some clearinghouse for this process to move between the progressive lifting of sanctions and the creation of conditions for elections. Neither Maduro's position of lifting sanctions all first, please, and then we'll talk elections, nor the US position, which is constant insistence on conditions for competitive elections without actually showing real willingness to lift sanctions, the point regarding the humanitarian fund last year being relevant in that regard. Neither of those is going to withstand a negotiation process. There have to be concessions. And what I find interesting about this international conference is the idea of a broad group of friends with supporters of both sides and those with a position of relative neutrality, such as Brazil and Argentina, which have sent quite high-level delegations as well to this event, can create a forum in which there are guarantors to make sure that both sides comply with the promises they have made as regards the concessions which they're going to do, and that moves in step. And that would be the ideal outcome. But of course, we don't know whether that's going to happen. We don't know the specifics. We don't know what sanctions are on the table. And we certainly don't know how far Maduro is willing to go to lift those different mechanisms of control over the electoral process, which he has in place at the moment. Maduro's calculation here is absolutely key, and you have to underline it. Maduro does not want to lose power at the elections next year, but he also wants as legitimate a poll as possible, as competitive as possible. And the key factor which would allow him to have as competitive election as possible, which he would almost certainly win, because that's what he needs, is to have economic improvement in Venezuela. And that requires lifting sanctions. If he is not able to lift sanctions, or there's no promise of such, he will probably move towards a more repressive political context next year without conditions for competitive elections. So the stakes are very high. The question is the question, of course, is how that process can be managed. I can't give you a definitive answer to that, Michael, because there's a lot up in the air. It's good that there are countries willing to get involved in overseeing that process. But at the same time, and I'm sure you're going to come to this later, there are lots of spoilers on different sides who could get in the way. And it's going to be about managing the spoilers. And if those powerful countries like Brazil, within the region or within the world, of course, of Brazil, the United States, the European Union, and others in Latin America can make sure that those spoilers are kept quiet, that they will have done a great job. But it remains very uncertain.
So, Marsilia, after today's conference, and once the public statement that comes out of that conference is made public, what would you consider a success? I mean, what would make this conference successful in terms of helping to move the Venezuelan negotiations forward?
Well, I think it must guarantee that the other players, as Ivan mentioned, like Brazil and Argentina, it's not clear how Brazil will fit into this arrangement, but we need to guarantee that they would enforce the rules, or even not break up the diplomatic relations, but not always being so nice to the Venezuelan government, because I think the main question is Chavismo playing fair? We really don't know, right? There were many other initiatives that were failed. What will Chavismo do when they realize they can lose the elections during this negotiation process? I mean, in 2016, there was no recall referendum because Maduro knew he would lost. And after 2015 legislative elections, they prevented the opposition from having qualified majority in the National Assembly. So if Venezuela tried to gain time and instrumentalize negotiations in its favor, we need to be on alert to do that. I think Brazil must be Brazil. Lula will face a huge opposition domestically if decides to go ahead with these negotiations from the opposition, of course. So I think the public opinion won't see these negotiations very positive. He needs to make clear inside Brazil, domestically and globally, what are the intentions and how far can Brazil goes to guarantee the successful of these initiatives.
So in terms of the content, Marsilia, of the communique that is going to come out of this conference, what would help Lula gain support internally in Brazil to explore this line of thought? I mean, what exactly would be a demand for elections for specific dates? Would it be Venezuela rejoining the OAS or the Inter-American Human Rights Treaty? I mean, what exactly do you think that would help Lula to pursue this path?
I think an electoral calendar and the guarantee of fair and free elections. But the problem is that the Venezuela is about the voting process, right? Because it's not there is no many evidence that Venezuela officials manipulated the polls. So I think an electoral calendar would be good, but if Venezuela quit the negotiations, would be a big failure for Lula here, domestically speaking.
Right. Benedict, yesterday, Maduro said publicly he was willing to go back to negotiations if the U.S. helped to implement the humanitarian fund, the social fund. And they added all sorts of conditions, additional conditions to return to the talks. Some of them seem, almost impossible to implement. Like, for example, stopping the international investigation.
I'm sorry, your sound is off, or at least I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I
can
can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Maduro said he was willing to go back if the social fund was implemented, if all sanctions were removed, and if the international community stopped the investigations for human rights violation in the high court that are currently taking place. So, these are high demands, and some of them, quite honestly, are impossible to implement, right? So my question really for you is the following. I mean, why would the US trust that this initiative it will help move this negotiation forward? I mean, it seems to me that, the region has, particularly those presidents are coming from the left, have a very strong view, particularly based on their vision of what has happened in Cuba, that these sanction policies don't really work, and that end up creating more problems than what already existed. But on the other hand, President Biden has been trying to use sanctions not as permanent punishments, but as tools for negotiation. So why should they trust Petro, really, and this initiative in helping the Norwegians-mediated talks in Mexico City move forward? Why should the US, take note and say, yes, this is going to be helpful?
Yeah, well, there's lots of reason for distrust, and of course the what Maduro said yesterday, and also there were several events that happened yesterday that were not very helpful. And of course, those claims are that of Maduro to stop the International Criminal Court is impossible. They have already Venezuela is a member of the court, so it's contradictory. It's impossible. And the best way to interpret it is perhaps as going out high in the beginning of some kind of new negotiations. And of course, with all the history, the large part of the Venezuelan opposition does not trust Petro at all. They see him as kind of the Chavez in the early phases, and so there's all sorts of reason why not to have faith in it. But I also think that the US has a lot of reasons to really appreciate this. I think for me, the best thing that could come out of this meeting is actually some kind of confirmation that the Latin American left-wing governments place a lot of emphasis in democracy and in human rights and in all of those issues that have been historically a main platform for left-wing governments, but that more over the last 2 decades you've seen democratic backsliding in a lot of left-wing countries. To have that as kind of reconfirming that as a major community, a democratic community that could also support further dialogue and negotiations. On the topic of sanctions, I think that I think it's absolutely necessary to appreciate the Biden administration's flexibilization of sanctions, or the willingness to flexibilize them. I think it's totally understandable that they don't want to, and they cannot just remove the sanctions overnight for all sorts of reasons. And most of them are, of course, internal political reasons, that would be impossible in the current situation and in the US. And I've been very critical of sanctions over many years. But I also think that now that the sanctions are in place, it doesn't make sense to just remove them without any concessions on the part of the Maduro government. So I think that, and actually, if you look at experiences with sanctions elsewhere, it's just a tiny little part of sanctions globally that have been lifted just because the goal was fulfilled. In most cases, it is a negotiation and a gradual lifting of sanctions based on the achievement, if there's goals achieved at all, but achievement of partial goals. So I think that is a very sensible strategy from the United States. And I think that Petro also has a lot of reasons to be trusted. He has a strong incentive both for changing the situation in Venezuela, but also for showing to his own constituents or the Colombian electorate that he is not a Chavez in the early phases, that he is a Democrat. He wants to place emphasis on the rule of law and democratic governance. So I think that, and also Colombia has been involved in the negotiations over a long time in many different ways. There's also a very close relationship between the Norwegian and the Colombian governments, and it has been since the beginning, or since many years actually, before the peace negotiations in Colombia. And so it doesnnis mean that this is a completely, although the Norwegian government has not had anything to do with that, the current conference, there is a kind of an international community that has supported many efforts to make Venezuela return to democracy, that is behind this initiative as well.
Ivan, you mentioned spoilers. Can you talk a little bit more about who do you think the different spoilers might come from to undermine this initiative and even the talks in Mexico City, and if Petro will be able to keep them at bay? I mean,
where do we begin, Michael? That's I
think it's important. I mean, because there's a lot of skepticism about whether there is a potential solution to the Venezuelan situation. Most negotiation processes in the past have failed, and have left the country with deeper wounds. So the question really is, I mean, Petro is making this audacious step in trying to help Venezuela solve its own problem and reinsert Venezuela internationally at a time where it is important for Venezuela, particularly in the region, to gain access to oil markets. So the question here, who are the spoilers? I mean, for example, Russia, the Lavrov was in Caracas a week ago. I think Russia is a big spoiler because they gain enormously from keeping Venezuela away from oil markets and not making no progress whatsoever. So who are other international spoilers that you think are relevant, and whether Petro is going to be able to keep them at bay?
Okay, Mark. No, I agree. I mean, there are a number of spoilers. There are also different techniques that spoilers can use as well, so it gets more complicated. But let's start with the fundamental spoiler, the part in the dispute which has a lot up their sleeve, which is of course the Maduro government. I mean, the Maduro government has spoiled previous negotiation rounds and is by far convinced in its entirety that it is worth taking the risk of going to really competitive elections in which powerful potential opposition candidates, such as Enrique Capriles, could stand against Maduro. That is a risk. It has backfired in other Latin American contexts, and of course, the famous case of 1990 in Nicaragua is often brought to attention. And they can't control the electoral process once you've opened the field and the campaign begins. Obviously, there's always the prerogative of the Maduro government to use its control over the judicial system to quash an election result. But that means pariah status. Once again, it means returning to the high levels of conflict of 2019 and all the risks that could ensue. So I don't think they would want to go that far. I think they would want to control the process. And if they don't see the possibility of winning in the first round, the only round of Venezuelan elections next year, they will put the brakes on this process. But there are others as well. Of course, there's the United States. Why has the United States found it so difficult to move forward in some of the basic sanctions relief, aside from Chevron, of course, the Chevron license, which it has made, particularly with the humanitarian fund, because of a resistance within Congress, from within the Democratic Party itself, from resistance within elements of the State Department, from the opposition of the Republican Party, from the opposition in Florida. The United States, at the highest levels of government, I think would like to move forward on sanctions relief in a clear set of targeted lifting to get towards those free elections. But it's hard, and there's maybe a limited willingness to take those risks in the United States. Perhaps for the next few months there will be an appetite for risk. After that, I think it's more uncertain, particularly once the presidential campaign begins. But I'd like to throw in two more. Obviously, you have the fragmented opposition, which is we saw what happened with the arrival of Guaido yesterday. But on the other side of the opposition, on perhaps the less radical side, you have forces which are closer to the Maduro government and also have placed the argument that they want to be involved in future talks, whether it's in Mexico, whether to be consulted about the outcome of this Bogotá conference. And they complicate the picture. In some ways, Maduro's ideal would see bits of the opposition fighting against one another in front of the international community as a proof that there's no way to actually negotiate with them. And the opposition perhaps sometimes plays into Maduro's hands by raising different positions and sparring against one another more regularly. And the last spoiler is, of course, within the Colombian government itself. There is not a seamless position on behalf of the dynamics of this conference of an international group of friends without Venezuelan representation moving the process forward. There have been discordant voices around which opposition the Colombian government should be engaging with. On Saturday, of course, Petro sat down for several hours with the opposition represented in the Mexico City talks, the unitary platform. But that's not all the opposition, as I mentioned earlier. And there have been voices saying that he should be engaging with other parts of the opposition. And of course, that would complicate the picture greatly and complicate US support for the process too. So there are all these different players. And I would just say very briefly, what techniques can these spoilers have? Well, one very simple technique is just not to agree and not to comply with what has been agreed, which you might say has been a little bit the shared approaches of the US government and the Maduro government until now, signing agreements and then making little progress. But there's another way of sabotage, and that is forum shopping. It's tremendously important that this conference feeds back in to a renewed Mexico City process. What is not desirable is that you have a multiplication of different processes, perhaps the direct US line to Caracas, the international initiative taking place now, remnants of Mexico, ongoing talks in Caracas, and that the Maduro government choose which one it wants to take part in, as it did, of course, in 2019, in accordance with its desires. There needs to be an integration of efforts. And I'm very glad to say that Dag Nylander, who, of course, is synonymous with the Mexico negotiations as the principal Norwegian facilitator, is there at the moment in Bogotá representing Norway. These links crucially important. There should not be a fragmentation, because if these negotiation efforts fragment, there will be all sorts of opportunities for spoilers to do their work discreetly.
Benedict, forum shopping, I think it's a great point. Is there a huge risk of that we start seeing the emergence of forum shopping that keep delaying any consistent outcome in terms of the Venezuelan negotiation process?
Yeah, I think that's an absolute risk. And that was why I emphasized the sort of importance that there is already a couple of agreements that you could build on and you can continue that track. And I think there's already some kind of form shopping. There's a lot of dialogue going on internally in Venezuela. Between different social groups, the government, the business sector, different other social sectors, and that's constantly used by the government to say that, hey, we're dialoguing all the time. We're not sabotaging any kind of dialogue. We're into dialogue all the time in the kind of forums that we can control, that where we don't have to give anything really important, where we don't have really to give away power. And so I think that is it is a possible outcome that kind of some completely new format is thought up, and that is possible. And I think also it would be unfortunate because it would fragment even further the efforts and also possibly the opposition. And so I think that is something that should absolutely and clearly be avoided, and it's a risk. I think also that you've seen some kind of imminent direct negotiation now between the government and the U.S. with some what the Juan Gonzalez came up with a list of demands from the U.S. and then there was a list of demands from the Maduro government just yesterday and a few days ago, and that could be understood as we're now into a different game where there's a direct negotiation with Petro as the mediator. I don't think that would be very fortunate because it doesn't look at the sort of long-term institutional arrangements that is the kind of the focus of the Mexico track.
I have a final question both for Marsilia and Ivan, and it's basically the same question. Chavismo has many alternatives to Mexico City. Basically, they don't need a negotiation to set up a time schedule for the elections. They can come up unilaterally with that time schedule, which would even involve moving the election forward. They can return or dejudicialize the political parties that are currently judicially intervened by the Supreme Court. They can remove certain bans, not all of them on different presidential candidates. They can do that without Mexico City or without, sitting in Bogotá, accepting to do that. So my question is a hard question. Let's suppose Maduro does the bare minimum, the very bare minimum. In a context in 2018 when he was running for re-election, the region had a very different landscape than what it has today. So if he does the very bare minimum, which does not qualify exactly as free and fair, but there's some additional changes, and he manages to win, abstention rates are high, the opposition splits, which is what opposition needs to do in order to win that election in a country where you only have there's no second round. The election is decided in just one single round. So there's no run-up. So let's suppose that happens. Do you think Lula will recognize Marsilia? Do you think Petro will recognize, independently on whether the U.S. does? And what will that mean? I mean, in terms of U.S. Latin American relationships, if that outcome it turns out to be Maduro's alternative to the talks and to any negotiation. Marsilia.
Wow, very easy, right? This question.
Will Lula recognize the election? Do you think Lula will recognize?
No, I think I think Lula must recognize the mistakes committed by the manipulation on the elections. It means to pose it against Maduro government, because Lula wants to show it's a new area of the left of his government, or for the pink tide of the region, right? So I think if Lula just be aside of Maduro after these manipulations on the elections, or the problems the elections can have, he will have like a eternal stamp on the of unfair or undemocratic leftist politician. So I think it's not a matter of if he will or won't. He needs to recognize the procedures that are not fair and are not expecting these negotiations.
Ivan?
I think for Petro and for other democratic left-wing governments to be able to get behind the Venezuelan election and say this is a legitimate poll, they have to see something rather more like 2021, which were the regional and local elections, than 2018. And by that I mean that there really has to be a proper neutral observation mission. There has to be freedom to campaign, but also I think, and perhaps more than 2021, there has to be the possibility of serious opposition candidates standing and not being quashed by the government and prohibited from standing. If you have an election like 2018, and the hallmark of 2018 was the incapacity of the opposition to field its most important candidates. If you have something like that again, then it's going to be very difficult for Petro to turn to his own turbulent domestic constituencies and say, this is the product of all my work on Venezuela, the product of the renewed ties with Venezuela, is that we have something looking more like democracy in the country. People won't believe him, and he will be discredited by his association with what is going on in Caracas. And do remember, of course, that although we have a left-wing, left-leaning wave in Latin America at the moment, it's fairly precarious. The cycle will turn. It could well turn. It's very likely to start turning at the end of this year when Argentina goes to the polls, and the likelihood of a Peronist victory is extremely slim at the moment. And the possibility of a pretty far-right victory is also quite high. So this will perhaps start to move Latin America in the other direction. And if in the midst of this process, Petro, who seeks a historic transformation, who seeks to hand on to a successor president in his image, and preferably allied with his own political force, if then in the middle of that he becomes associated with some electoral shenanigans along the lines of what we saw in 2018, it's going to do him a lot of damage. So he's got a lot invested in this now. And I'm not entirely sure he has realized all the potential consequences of backing that process in Venezuela. So there comes a moment when you feel that the Colombian government might just have to say, enough is enough. We can't do any more. We will deal with Caracas on a transactional basis, but no more. It's all in the air at the moment, Michael. What more can I say?
Yeah, very final question for you, Benedicta. It's U.S. elections are coming up. There's a fear that with those elections, the possibility of, flexibilizing sanctions is going to be very difficult for President Biden due to internal political opposition to that decision. So are we running out of time? Do you think Venezuela is running out of time for a peaceful political resolution to its political conflict?
I don't want to say that, but yes, there is a window of opportunity the next months, and especially because of the situation in the U.S. I think there is an interest now in the U.S. To flexibilize sanctions that one should try to make the most of. I don't think it's so much for the economic interest for replacing the Russian oil with the Venezuelan oil, but rather I think it has some broader kind of global political dimensions, in the sense that the US needs to change its image in many ways in Latin America. You have China, you have Russia being very kind of active and vocal actors, and the US is left with the image of the kind of the one that comes to punish with sanctions, with threats. And I think that is really important for the US to change. And one way of doing it is, of course, to engage really with in dialogue with Venezuela and try to gradually lift the sanctions based on some concessions. Super difficult, and yes, it is. There's sort of running out of time, but there's still some months to go. So let's should we just end on a positive note? Hope that this can re-energize a little bit the kind of the international community to engage in that and to make things move.
Well, thank you on that note, and thank you all for this great conversation. And on behalf of the Wilson Center's Latin American program, thank you for providing these very interesting insights on what's going on in Venezuela and this and Colombia's initiative to address the political conflict in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Bye-bye.
Thank you.